Let's finally implement object-oriented programming now and start with the constructor functions. And as always, I already have to start our file open here in my VS Code editor. So we actually kind of use object-oriented programming before, but in a very limited way because we have no way of programmatically creating object. And so all we did was to use some simple object literals. But now that all changes with the constructor functions, so we can use constructor functions to build an object using a function. Now a constructor function is actually completely normal function. The only difference between regular function and a function that we call constructor function is that constructor function with a new operator. Let's now actually create a constructor function for a person. So that person and OP, there is convention that constructor function always start with a capital letter. And so we should always follow that convention too. And in fact, other built-in constructor like array or map follow that convention as well. Now here I'm using function expression. We can also use function declaration, but an arrow key function will actually not work as a function constructor. That's because it does not have its own this keyword, and we need that. So only function declaration and function expression. Now remember that this function is basically going to produce an object, in this case for a person. So we want a person to have name, or let's say first name and birth year, and we specify these two parameters for that here in our constructor function so that we can then pass at the name and birth year. And now we call these functions, and so as I said previously, the only difference between the regular function and constructor function is that we call the constructor function using the new keyword. So we write the new and then person, and then we pass the name called John and body is 1991. So this new operator here is actually very special operator because it does is to call this function here. So this person function. So but it does a whole lot more than just that. So let's see what exactly happen when we call a function with a new operator like this. So behind the scenes there has been 4 steps. So first, a new empty object is created. Then afterward, this function is called, and this function called that these keywords will be set to this newly created object. So this keyword is this new empty object. So basically in the execution context of passing function, that this keyword will reply to this new object here that was created in step number 1. And remember all, if this happens only because we are calling the function using the new operator here. So step number 3 is this newly created object is linked to the prototype. Finally, the last step is that the object that was created in the beginning is then automatically returned from the constructor function. So the function automatically returns that empty object from the beginning. But actually this point, the objects no longer need to be empty. And this is actually the trick of making the constructor function work. When we log the console, this keyword, and so we already know that this should be this empty object that was created here in step number 1. Because this keyword inside these functions will be exactly that empty object. And again, that's because we are calling it with the new keywords. So let's see. Indeed, we get to this empty object, and the browser console is actually telling us it's basically here of the type of the person, and this is the name of the constructor function. And now let's use this knowledge to our advantage because we already know that at the end of this function, this keyword will basically be returned, and so whatever we add this empty object will then be returned from the function, and that return object is gonna be the object that we are trying to build here. So all we need to do is to take that first name parameter, so the value that we receive, and then create property on this keyword with the same name, and then set it to that value, and then the same with the birth year equal to birth year. And so now we store the result here in some variable. That's actually it. So let's see what John is gonna look like when we console log here. Indeed, here it is. Here is the person object with the first name John and the birth year 1991 that we pass into the constructor function. So let's quickly recap what happened here. So we are calling these constructor functions with a new keyword or new operator Therefore, new empty object is created right away. And then function is called, and then here's this keyword is that empty object. And then in the function, we start to set the property to that object. And we give the exact same name as the parameter that we are passing in here. And of course, they could have any other name. So it doesn't have to be the same name as our arguments. So it doesn't have to be the same name as our parameters. But this is kind of convention. So if we pass a first name, then we should also create property called first name. So then here, by the end of the function, or this keyword now has these two new properties. And then here in step number 4, that object was created in the beginning is then automatically returned from the function. And so at this point, that is the object with these two properties. And so that's gonna be the result of this function call. And so now we can use these constructor functions to create as many different objects as we want. So we can create many objects like this. This construction function is now like a blueprint for the house, and then each of these objects that we create through that function. So through that blueprint will be actual house and a real world. So in this case, the actual objects with the actual data in them. So now each of them is its own new object that we created programmatically using a function constructor. Remember that in classical object-oriented programming, an object created from the class is called an instance. Now we did not technically create a class here because as we discussed before, JavaScript does not really have a classes in the sense of traditional OOP. However, we did create an object from the constructor function, and actually 3 objects. And the constructor functions have been used since the beginning of the JavaScript to kind of simulate classes. And therefore, we can still say that John, Matilda, Jack here are instances of person. And in fact, there is an even operator that we can use to test for that. John is instance of and then person. This will return either true or false. Now, if you create something here like this, and then if we do like this will of course be false, because of course we didn't create this variable here. And since we are talking about instances here, so we can also say that this property will be the instance properties. And that's because properties first name and birth year will be available on the other instances that are created through this constructor function. So that's for the properties. But now what about methods? So what if we wanted to add a method to our objects? Well, just like we added properties, so we can of course also add the methods like this. This will work fine here, but this is actually a really bad practice. So you should never do this. You should never create a method inside of a constructor function. That's because imagine we're gonna create 100 or 1,000 or even tens of thousands of person objects using this constructor function. Then what will happen is each of these objects will carry around this function here. So if we have 1,000 objects, we will essentially create 1,000 copies of this function. And so that will be terrible for the performance of our code. Again, don't do this, but instead to solve this problem, we're gonna use prototypes and a prototype instance. So this is a basic of constructor functions. Just note that function constructors are not really a feature of JavaScript language. Instead, they are simply a pattern that has been developed by other developers. And now everyone simply use this. So the real magic really here is this new operator. So the most important thing to understand from this video is these are really 4 steps.